Imagine this. A man who could buy islands, private jets, even entire skyscrapers, yet couldn't buy a single moment of peace in his heart. That man was Richard Hayes. To the outside world, Richard was the definition of success. He was the kind of billionaire newspapers loved to write about: sharp suits, a real estate empire that stretched across continents, and the kind of net worth that most people couldn't even imagine. But behind the glossy headlines, behind the photos of him smiling on red carpets, was a man drowning in silence. Richard lived in a mansion perched on the cliffs of California, with glass walls that reflected the setting sun and marble floors that sparkled under chandeliers. From the outside, it looked like a palace. But if you stepped inside, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the beauty. It was the emptiness. His dining room had a table that could seat 20 guests, but it hadn't hosted a dinner party in years. The kitchen was state-of-the-art, yet the plates were always set for one. His massive bed felt more like a prison than a place of rest. The halls echoed when he walked through them, and sometimes at night he swore he could hear the faint laughter of his wife, gone, but still haunting the walls. 2 years earlier, tragedy had struck. Richard's wife, Emily, had been the love of his life. They met when he was still just a young man building his empire, long before the billions and the headlines. She had been his anchor, his balance, his reason to smile after exhausting days at work. Then one rainy evening, she was gone in a car accident that shattered Richard's world in an instant. Since then, his mansion had become more like a mausoleum than a home. He threw himself into work, expanding his empire with even more obsession, but no amount of money filled the hole inside his chest. He had no children to carry forward his legacy, no family dinners, no warm hugs waiting for him at the end of the day. There was only silence. Well, silence, and one constant presence. Her name was Angela. Angela was his maid, a quiet woman in her late 30s with kind eyes and a gentle voice. She was always punctual, always professional. She cooked his meals, cleaned the enormous mansion, and made sure everything ran smoothly. Richard often passed her in the halls without a word. To him, she was simply part of the background, necessary, reliable, but invisible in a way. What Richard didn't know was that Angela noticed everything. She noticed the way he stared too long at his wife's portrait in the study. She noticed how he never touched the piano Emily used to play. She noticed that even when he sat in his office surrounded by gold and glass, his shoulders sagged under a weight money couldn't lift. But Angela never said a word. She did her job, offered polite greetings, and kept her own struggles hidden, away. Every evening, Richard came home, ate in silence, and retreated to his study to drink whiskey while staring out at the endless ocean. And every evening, Angela quietly tidied up, collected the dishes, and disappeared before the night swallowed the house again. For 2 years, this was the routine. A lonely billionaire, drowning in grief, and a maid who carried her own untold story. Neither of them knew that one ordinary Friday evening would change everything. It started with something small: Richard leaving work earlier than usual. Normally, he stayed in his office until the city lights blinked on, avoiding the emptiness of his home. But that day, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt the urge to return before sunset. As his driver pulled up the long driveway, Richard noticed how strange it felt to come back while the sky was still painted in colors of orange and pink. The mansion glowed in the fading light, but he didn't feel comforted. If anything, the thought of stepping into that quiet place made his chest tighten. Still, he pushed open the grand doors and stepped inside. At first, it was exactly as he expected. The faint smell of polished wood, the echo of his footsteps across marble floors. But then he froze. Something was different. There was sound. not the hum of the refrigerator, not the distant crash of waves outside. This was something else, something he hadn't heard in his mansion in years, singing. Soft, gentle, beautiful. Richard's brows furrowed. For a moment he thought it was his imagination, some cruel trick of memory, bringing back the ghost of his wife's voice. But no, this wasn't Emily's singing. This was different, softer, fragile but filled with warmth. His heart pounded as he followed the sound through the hallways, each step pulling him closer. Finally, he reached the living room, and what he saw there made him stop in his tracks. Angela, his maid, the woman who moved through his house like a shadow, was sitting cross-legged on the floor. Beside her, a small boy, no older than 6, leaned over a notebook as she guided his hand across the page. She was singing a lullaby, the kind of tune a mother hums to calm her child, while the boy giggled and tried to copy the letters she traced with him. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. This was his home, his rules. And yet here was Angela, breaking the invisible barrier between staff and master, between her world and his. And more importantly, there was a child in his mansion. His voice came out sharper than he intended. "Angela, who is this?" The singing stopped. Angela's eyes widened, her face drained of color. The boy looked up, startled, and quickly hid behind her arm. In that single moment, the carefully built walls of silence around Richard Hayes began to crack. Richard's question hung in the air like thunder. "Angela, who is this child?" For a long moment, silence filled the living room. Angela's lips parted, but no words came. The boy clutched at her sleeve, his wide eyes darting nervously toward Richard. Richard, unused to being ignored in his own home, took a step closer. His voice softened, though confusion still clouded it. "Angela, explain. Who is he?" Angela swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "Sir, this is my son. His name is Daniel." The words hit Richard like a punch. He blinked, staring at the boy again, as if the truth might change if he looked twice. "Your son?" Angela nodded, her face pale. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Why is he here? Why have you never told me? For years you've worked under my roof, and I've never once seen or heard of him." Angela lowered her gaze to the floor. "Because I was afraid, sir." The boy peeked out from behind his mother's arm, his small voice breaking the heavy silence. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" Angela quickly wrapped her arms around him. "No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong." Her voice cracked, with emotion. Richard's stern expression faltered. The innocence in the child's question pierced through his frustration. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled heavily. "Angela, I need answers, now." She nodded, her shoulders slumping in surrender. "I never meant to hide him from you, but I had no one to watch him after school. I couldn't afford childcare, and sometimes I had no choice but to bring him with me while I finished my work here. I kept him out of sight because I was terrified that if you found out, you'd fire me, and I need this job to keep a roof over his head." Her voice trembled, tears welling in her eyes. "Daniel is all I have, sir. I couldn't risk losing everything." Richard stood frozen. He had expected excuses, maybe lies, but not this raw honesty. He glanced at the boy again, hiding against his mother's arm, and felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Compassion. Angela gently guided Daniel to sit on the couch before she continued. Her voice was steady now, though heavy with years of unspoken pain. "My husband left when Daniel was only a year old. He promised he'd be there for us, but one day, he just disappeared. No money, no support, nothing. I was left with a baby, bills, and no one to turn to. She clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles white. "I've worked every job I could find. Restaurants, cleaning, night shifts. But none of them paid enough to take care of Daniel. When I got this job here, I thought my prayers were answered. The pay was better, the hours stable. But it came with a rule. This house had no place for children." Angela's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "So I hid him. Not out of deceit, but out of desperation. Sometimes after school, when I couldn't leave him alone, I'd bring him here. We'd stay quiet, hidden. I taught him to stay in one room, to never make a sound." Richard's chest tightened as she spoke. He remembered those nights when he thought the house was silent, when in truth, a little boy had been here all along, breathing softly in the shadows. Angela's tears spilled over. "I didn't want to betray your trust, Mr. Hayes, but Daniel is everything to me. He's the reason I wake up each morning. I couldn't abandon him, not even for a job." Richard leaned back, his mind spinning. For years he had lived surrounded by silence, cursing his loneliness. And yet, under his very roof, there had been life. A child, a mother's love, a secret hidden not out of malice, but survival. Daniel's small voice broke through Richard's thoughts. I'm sorry if I made you mad." Richard blinked and looked at the boy. His innocence cut deeper than any explanation. For the first time in years, Richard's hardened heart cracked open. He crouched down to meet Daniel's eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong, son." The boy's shoulders relaxed. Angela gasped softly at Richard's gentle tone. Something had changed. The billionaire who once lived only for power and wealth was beginning to see something far greater in front of him. From that night on, things slowly began to change in the Hayes mansion. At first, Richard insisted Angela no longer hide Daniel. "If he needs to be here, then he'll be here. No more secrets," Richard said firmly. Angela hesitated, afraid it might still cost her job, but Richard's tone was sincere. "I want him to feel welcome." And so, for the first time, the mansion wasn't filled with silence, but with the sound of a child's laughter. One evening, Richard walked into the dining room to find Angela serving dinner, not just for him, but for Daniel as well. The boy sat nervously at the long table, feet dangling off the chair, eyes wide at the sight of golden cutlery. "Mr. Hayes," Angela began cautiously, "I hope you don't mind. Daniel was hungry and—" Richard raised a hand, smiling faintly. "It's fine, Angela. In fact, join me. Both of you." That dinner became the first of many. Daniel quickly lost his shyness. He asked endless questions about Richard's work. "So you own all those tall buildings? Do they touch the sky? Do you get to ride elevators every day?" Richard chuckled, surprised by how much he enjoyed answering. He found himself explaining things in ways simple enough for a child to understand. And for the first time in years, his conversations weren't about contracts or profits, but about dreams. Angela, too, began to open up. She shared stories of Daniel's childhood, of the struggles they had faced, and of the small joys they clung to. Sometimes she would cook meals from her own culture, spiced stews, warm bread, dishes that filled the mansion with aromas it had never known before. Richard ate them gratefully, each bite reminding him that life still had flavor beyond champagne and caviar. Slowly, Richard realized something extraordinary. He wasn't just tolerating their presence. He was looking forward to it. One night, as he stood in the hallway, he heard Daniel's laughter echoing from the living room as Angela tickled him. Richard closed his eyes, and for a fleeting second, he felt as though Emily's spirit was smiling at him. His mansion was no longer a tomb of grief. It was becoming a home again. And in the quiet moments, Richard noticed Angela in a new light. Not just as his maid, but as a strong woman, a mother who had carried the weight of the world for her child. Her resilience humbled him. Her kindness softened him. And slowly, without realizing it, he began to heal. Weeks turned into months, and Richard found himself dreading the idea of the house returning to silence. He knew what he had to do. One evening, he called Angela into his study. She entered nervously, wringing her hands. "Is something wrong, Mr. Hayes?" Richard gestured for her to sit. "Angela, I've been thinking a lot lately. About you, about Daniel." Angela's heart pounded. She feared this was the end, that he was about to let her go. But Richard's next words stunned her. "You've given me something no amount of money ever could. You brought life back into this house. You gave me family again." Her lips parted, but no sound came. "I don't want you to just work here anymore," Richard continued. "I want you to stay here, not as staff, but as part of this home. I want Daniel to grow up knowing he belongs, not hiding in the shadows. I'll take care of his education, his future. Whatever he needs, I'll provide." Angela's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Richard said softly. "Say you'll let me be part of your family, as much as you've become part of mine." For the first time in years, Angela let her tears fall freely. She nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes. Thank you, Richard. Thank you." At that moment, Daniel came running into the study, hugging Richard tightly around the waist. "Does this mean we can stay? For real?" Richard smiled, his own eyes glistening. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "For real, Daniel. You're not going anywhere." And just like that, the lonely billionaire's life was transformed. The mansion that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter. The man who once measured his worth in billions now found his wealth in love. And the maid who once lived in fear now stood tall, knowing her son's future was secure. Richard often thought back to that one evening, the night he came home early, the night he discovered the secret that shattered his loneliness and rebuilt his life. And he would always say the same thing. "I thought I had lost everything." But sometimes, family finds you in the most unexpected way.